Okay, talking about medical issues. So, as Earl said, we've been running these seminars or practitioners groups for, geez, I'd say it's pretty close to over 20 years now. Probably started in the early 90s. And it's been a great opportunity to deal with CRA and just get an idea of where there's agreement and areas where there's contention. So the medical issues have really focused on 2 or 3 key issues, and we're going to talk about those today. And there's some minor issues as well that we can deal with that are related really to the top 3 issues. And to take a little look back, if you want to go to our website, we can see that these issues have been addressed in numerous presentations going back through 2016 up to today by myself, Julie Bond, the groups at RDP, Brian Cookson, and Andrew McPhail, as well as the Maurice Goulet. So different perspectives on the same issues. And what I'm going to do today is a bit of a recap. And that's kind of why Julie and I were developing this together, and we decided that for flow it was probably better that one person go through so we don't step on the same issues. All right. So in late 2019, there was a paper released, a direction paper, on the SR&ED claims for medical practitioner corporations. And this is an area where there's a fair amount of uncertainty right now, and has been for probably about 4 or 5 years. And we'll talk about today about the current issues, a brief history of it, but more importantly, where the issues are today and where we can expect to go forward with that. So what we look at here is 2 scenarios. And the first scenario is the physician is an independent contractor, so a proprietor, as opposed to doing work in his or her medical corporation. And ultimately, the way that the Canada Revenue Agency is looking at this is interesting, that work is either done by the researcher directly, I would call it, or it's done on behalf of another party. And these terms become important as we're starting to go through the legislation a little bit later on. And anyways, to make a long story short, what the position is for an individual is that they could be doing the research themselves, in which case they would claim it on their T1 return. They could be doing research for another party, in which case we may have a contract payment or government assistance, and we're going to talk about that. And they may have a case where it's mixed, in which case we'll talk about the implications there as well, but there would be a potential claim for the work done and paid for by the party themselves. Okay? So the individual physicians can basically claim qualified expenditures, whether they're doing it for themselves or for another party. And this is the same for a medical practitioner corporation, except the fundamental difference here is that the medical practitioner corporation could be doing the work themselves or another party, or again both, but the one stipulation or the addition here is that the medical corporation could be doing supporting work for a job done by the physician. So the physician's in scenario 1, whereas the physician's employees are in the medical corporation adding supporting work in there. So the question then again becomes, who claims it? And ultimately what happens is the CRA is now focused on the contract. Who does it say is in the contract performing the work? Does it engage the medical professional corporation, or does it in fact engage the individual? And if it engages the individual, then they might make the argument that the medical professional corporation has no right to claim its expenses, and it should be claimed by the individual physician. This becomes problematic because, again, the individual physicians are proprietors, which means they can't claim themselves, which means they have no salary, again, and this will ultimately be very negative on the claim. Secondly, you generally always want to claim in a corporation as opposed to a proprietorship because the credits vary differently. Okay. So this brings us into a series of definitions that are going to be relevant then when doing this work. And the first is if we're doing work on behalf of another party. Okay, so what does that mean if we're doing work on behalf of another party? And one of the key terms that's relevant here is a term called contract payment. Okay? And a contract payment is in subsection 127.9 of the Act, and it's basically a payment that you've received from another taxpayer for performing R&D. And the stipulation here is that if it's another Canadian taxpayer, that Canadian taxpayer actually has to file a claim under Section 37, which means they have to file a claim for SR&ED. So if another Canadian taxpayer pays me, a private company, and does not claim the SR&ED on that, had they been able to or not, I may be able to claim that as the performer. Again, the only issue there is that there's no double dip. The second category is if the work is done by any level of Canadian government or non-for-profit type personnel. So again, if you're getting funds from any level of Canadian government in order to do the research, then that would be seen as assistance and it would reduce the claim. So to summarize, a contract payment exists only if it's from government or another taxable supplier, okay? And that taxable supplier intends to claim the credits. So the implications are that Canadian source contract payments for SR&ED are generally going to reduce your claim along with government assistance, but foreign source payments will not. Now, in the CRA's paper, they also talked about certain factors to determine who did the work here. So are there legal agreements? Are there verbal or written agreements? Who has the obligation in these legal agreements to do the research? Now, one of the really interesting things, and this is one of the things from talking to practitioners that I found, is often a contract may say it's the individual who's contracted the doctor. However, all of the work and all of the fees and funds are paid to the medical corporation. So in practice, there's a bit of a discontinuity, and also what can happen is a contract may say that it's by the practitioner, and it can be done directly or through a medical professional corporation. So again, there's legal issues that can affect things back and forth. Okay. So when you're involved in these reviews or a medical review, we find that the CRA often requests a large amount of information. And we'll talk about some of that in a little bit. But particularly in preparing a claim, you want to think about what kinds of things should I look at beforehand to make sure that all the information flows in the right direction. So the things that they'll look at are, what are your major business activities? Are you providing services, or are you providing research, or a combination of the two? What do your agreements say with healthcare entities? How are you compensated? Is it salary? Is it wages? There's all kinds of different scenarios. So people may work for research hospitals where the hospitals collect all the funds and then keep a percentage of them for administrative duties, or you may have completely independent practices, and you may have all kinds of relationships in between that. So again, you want to be clear on how that works, and there is no solid rhyme or reason. I've seen all kinds of setups, many different ways, and it varies by hospital or research institution and by province widely. Okay, but basically you want to figure out at the end of the day how much salary was the physician paid, whether it was through a medical corporation that's eligible to claim, and how is that tracked? How do we differentiate between the work that's medical and work that's SR&ED, rather, research, and work that's non-SR&ED? So I'd say one of the fundamental problems centers around the interpretation of the words directly undertaken. And a sample, from a ruling or a response that CRA will have when they deny a taxpayer is that the wages of the employee were not directly undertaken on behalf of the taxpayer. And this is an interesting position, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail, because this is a legal position here. We're talking about the words directly undertaken in the Act itself, and then we have to look at a definition. What does directly undertaken mean? Okay, and from discussions with the CRA, I believe that the CRA interprets the words directly undertaken to mean that you're contracted directly and that the contract is not, in fact, to another party in the middle, and therefore you're taking it, working on it perhaps indirectly. They've never said this, but I'm saying the position that they're taking, it appears that that's the way that they're thinking. Okay, so last year before our presentation in 2019, we had feedback from the Director General. We've talked about this in our last presentation, so I won't speak much on it, but I've repeated it because the directives are still relevant. And the CRA is saying that they recognize that there can be cooperation and collaboration, and that's very common in research. However, it's up to each party to determine its own eligible expenses, and that's really what we're talking about now. So all parties agree that it's possible for the parties to claim, but it's very important that the parties keep proper records and can really delineate not only how much the expenses were, but who has the right to claim those. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the legislation to go back, because we're talking about the term directly undertaken. Okay? So I'm going to go back first and talk about the definition of SR&ED in 248 sub 1 of the Income Tax Act. And it specifically includes certain activities, including data collection, testing, and mathematical analysis that are commensurate with the needs of the projects. So very often what happens is you might see a researcher who perhaps has a project that they do as a staff member at a university or a professor there, but those contracts may be 2 or 3 days a week, and they may run their own private practice 2 or 3 days a week. So that's a common scenario. And in these cases, they may actually, in my opinion, be doing the research work at the university, which is their T1 work, and they get paid for as an individual. And then in their practice, they may actually be doing additional projects which follow up or expand on their university work in the nature of data collection, testing, and related analysis. So it's not uncommon to see not only one or another scenario as the new directive paper is put out, but actually both scenarios, that the individual is performing research both as an individual and through their medical professional corporation. Okay, so the Act itself, 37 sub 1, says that there may be deducted SR&ED expenses, which then leads to the credits for SR&ED carried on and directly undertaken by the taxpayer. So those are the words in the Income Tax Act themselves. And then for a definition of what does directly undertaken mean, we actually have to look at the definition in the Act. Now, the term contract payment, as we saw earlier, has a specific definition in the Act. I can go to 127 sub 9, and it says a contract payment has this specific definition. And in this case, a contract payment may not be what an average person may assume. If I ask an average person off the street, what's a contract payment, they may not say it's a payment for SR&ED where the other SR&ED claimant doesn't claim it, okay, or not. But in this case, the term directly engaged is not defined in the Act. There is no specific definition that I'm aware of the term directly engaged. Directly undertaken. So when there's no immediate definition, what the courts say is we go for a common law definition. What would a reasonable person interpreting those words feel directly undertaken means? I would propose that if I asked the average person, if you were directly undertaking something or were you directly engaged in something, would that not be synonymous? And I think most people would agree that that is. And therefore, I say that directly engaged is a little bit of a directive for us to look at. When I put these slides up, I know one of the comments of the CRA is that they felt I was confusing the terms directly engaged and directly undertaken. And I clarify that I'm not actually confusing them. I'm proposing that they're synonymous and that their definition of directly undertaken may be a little too constrictive to mean that you have to be the only person on the contract and there can be no one in between. Okay. So as I said, the term directly undertake is not defined in the Income Tax Act. I'm proposing that the term directly engaged is interesting and similar, and then we can get an example of what that means. And ultimately, if the work is directly undertaken, then the party that can do it can claim. And my position here in most of the scenarios that I've seen is particularly where two parties, an individual and a medical professional corporation, could claim, that both parties may in fact be able to claim. Okay. One of the issues that pops up in claims, or it used to, it's not as much prevalent anymore, is the issue of who owns intellectual property. And this is interesting for a number of reasons, and I believe that it actually impacts not only medical claims but claims in general. And one of the things that I want to say here is that eligibility to claim SR&ED credits does not require full ownership of intellectual property. It requires entitlement to exploit the results. And this is an issue that was originally outlined in the Interpretation Bulletin 151, which the Canada Revenue Agency replaced with a whole series of papers in 2012. But one of the things that the paper says is that you don't need to own the rights, you just have to have some preferential right to use it. It could be a royalty, it could be a preferential right to use the product in a place, it could be the right to use a patent. Again, it doesn't require absolute ownership of a technology, it requires an entitlement to exploit that technology, which is a fundamentally different concept. After the rewrite of the policy papers back in 2012, the CRA released in 2014 a third-party payment policy paper, and they've basically moved their entitlement to exploit results into that section dealing with third-party policy papers. I remember at the time that this happened having an issue. Oops, did I just blank? Sorry. I remember at the time this happened having an issue with the CRA on the entitlement to exploit issue and feeling that we'd won that, but the fact that they'd moved it to this other paper meant that it was going to get swept under the table or misinterpreted as it may be currently. And back in 2012 to 2015 period, we were assured by the previous Director General that this wouldn't be the case and that nothing had changed. But what I'd say here is that there seems to be a clear shift in policy on the entitlement to exploit issue, and it's something that should be addressed and probably clarified in a future paper. Okay. The second major issue dealing with medical claims is what they call alternative funding, or basically government assistance. Now, the typical response that we would get on a denial before was that the researcher, whether through their professional corporation or as an individual, received part of his or her payments, whether it's OHIP payments in Ontario or whatever, they received an additional amount called alternative funding. And this was to represent whether if people were specialists or people were working in outlying areas, and we'll talk about what it really means. But it has a number of factors. It could be upwards of 50 factors, I would say, and research is one of them. So basically, doctors who are specialists or engage in certain activities get a premium of payment, and they can use this premium here. They can have this payment deemed to be government assistance. And the effect of having that is that the government assistance will then reduce any amount that they can claim for the SR&ED. Now, so previously, one of the things that they were doing is they were taking anything that they called academic funds or AFP payments for academic funds, and they're also looking at other things like something called clinical repair funds and other things of that nature. since then, we've argued successfully, I'd say, that the academic funds may be research, but the clinical repair funds probably are not. And the CRAs subsequently recently agreed that that's a reasonable breakdown. The one position that they were taking before, and this was based on their own policy, was that the amount of government assistance had to be allocated reasonably. And the position that they had is if there wasn't a reasonable breakdown, then 100% of any funding would be included. So the effect here was that in many cases a doctor would agree that maybe 5 or 8 or 10% of the AFP funding might be research related, but it probably wasn't 100%, and that was an unreasonable position. However, it was very hard to support that position, and we'll talk a little bit about why those problems happened. Okay. So basically the new position is the CRA is willing to look at reasonable basis and say, well, what do you think is reasonable for these allocations? And the funny things that we'll talk about are the fact that there probably should be a trail to provide the CRA with the information that they're looking for. But basically, the key stipulation is that there's a lot of vagaries and there's a lot of problems that can come in that interpretation. Okay? Now, what the Act says is the reduction for qualified expenditures are against any of the AFP payments or any of the payments that reasonably can be considered in respect of the scientific research. Okay? A quick example of an AFP practice model in Ontario would say that the AFP models cover things like community services, individuals in single departments, a whole list of specialties, and research, along with a variety of things. So the real question is saying, out of all the AFP payments and all of the possible reasons that they could be dealt with, what percentage of that was related to research? And the CRA, I believe, has a good position here that they are required to get a reasonable allocation of this. And the problem is that even though many of the actual contracts with the doctors and these research organizations say that these projects and things are supposed to be approved by every member every year, in the contract, legally, it almost never happens. So there's an issue that legally we should have the information, but in reality, it doesn't exist. And perhaps the CRA is right in saying, well, that's not their fault that the hospitals or the research organizations themselves are not willing to provide the breakdowns to the constituents or to the researchers. And I can say from personal experience that it can be a very touchy issue that some of the larger research hospitals, and it's the more senior researchers that'll confide in me and tell me, because they don't really have as much to fear, they're on their way out, that it's really not in anyone's interest to rock the boat, as they say, by asking too many questions about how money's spent or allocated. And that can tend to get management upset at you and affect your career, where they want you to focus on the research and not the business side of things. Okay, so there's a lot of politics involved in playing here, but I think that fundamentally there's weaknesses on all sides, and that the CRAs making the best of a situation where they need reasonable allocations that should be made, but basically the organizations responsible are not providing that information. Okay, so there's shortcomings all the way around. Okay? One of the interesting things is that a lot of these initiatives that we're talking about the AFP and the directly engaged, started as local initiatives rather than a federal initiative that went through a stakeholder analysis or things, and were vetted and discussed by people like us. However, I'd say that in the last year or two, and we'll talk about some statistics to back this up, things have started to come back on track. The medical paper is a great step in that right direction to understand what are the problems with claims and the interpretations of it. Can we communicate this, and then can we give the claimants the opportunities to correct any problems that might have prevented them, if possible, in order that they can claim it? And we'll talk about some of the planning that we can do on that as we go. Okay, So some of my recommendations are: one, improve reporting by hospitals and research organizations themselves in order to provide those breakdowns or reasonable allocation of the assistance. That would be fantastic. Okay. One of the issues that we brought up was the number of objections, and I think that from speaking to CRA in the objections office there, the number of objections for medical has stopped growing and has become stable. So that's not a huge problem that we have right now. And also, you know, one of our big issues before was the consistency or what we perceived as inconsistency of the guidelines across Canada. And again, this new paper and the new directives, I think, will help hopefully get some level of national consistency here. Okay. Now, one of the issues that's popped up out of, I would say, the first two issues is evidence of actual SR&ED where an individual or a researcher is hired, often by a foreign group to help them with a study. Okay? And the question then becomes, is the researcher under contract doing experimental development, SR&ED, or are they really just fulfilling the contract and doing more of a clerical task where they'll you know, test patients, collect data, and provide the data to the sponsor that's paying them, but not really be involved in the analysis of the data, the development of the protocols, or so forth. They're really performing a data collection procedure without any related research. And this is going to be a question of judgment every time. But the question is, what would be reasonable evidence? And this is where it gets kind of tricky, because often the types of research that go on are regular meetings that they have, or webcasts, or things that may or may not have transcripts. They're often emails or notes on listing changes to protocols. But the protocols may be in a specialist area. So often, you know, scenarios I've seen is that there may be a worldwide study going on in different countries, and one or two particular specialists in Canada may be engaged. And those specialists may in turn have their own specialties where they're trying to take the protocols and maybe adjust them in some way based on their specialty. So I've seen situations where this information was provided and the CRA's response was that there were no documents available to substantiate the contribution to the hypothesis, formulation, or design of the protocol. So, you know, in these cases, I don't know whether it's problems with particular reviewers and they're ignoring information, or more an issue of what information is relevant here, and understanding that it is somewhat hard to catch because they may be very little ideas or concepts that may have effects at the end. So one of the questions is, well, how much of a degree? Do I have to change all the protocols? Can I make a small degree of change in the protocol? How much is relevant enough in order to create the eligibility for SR&ED? And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So just closing off on the new document, they have a list of some of the documents that they're going to request. And most of those are relatively easy to understand. Evidence of scientific uncertainties, departures from standard practice, the study protocols and amendments are the ones that you would typically think of them asking for. One of the some of the other things that they're looking for are, you know, the ethics board documentation, the clinical study agreements, the actual patient consent forms, variations of those, right? Again, so your question might be, why are they looking at all of these other documents? What's the purpose of that? And there are purposes of that. But understanding this when you're doing a claim and what information is in those documents and how it may affect the claim is, I'd say, very important too, and not well understood in the community. So I think that there could be some future direction on why are we asking for this and what should you do in order to make sure that you're conforming to the rules to the best of your ability within all of these frameworks. Okay. All right, now some of the recommendations, and these slides are done by myself and part of our group as well. we recommend is look at your contracts. If you have a problem where arguably the contract between your corporation was with you as an individual, with the payer was with you as an individual instead of your medical professional corporation, maybe see if you can redo the contract. The other thing is on your timekeeping. Keep track of your actual time versus the time that you actually spend. So if you work evenings, weekends, etc., and so forth on the research, and you can back that up, that's all legitimate time, and it should be included. Okay. One of the other things we'll talk about is the pre-claim project review. It's not done very often, but as we'll see from the statistics, but I think it's an opportunity here to get an initial feeling on whether there's going to be problems and perhaps some directives as to all of the issues that we talked about. What's the importance of these papers? Am I following a procedure or a path that's optimizing these, or perhaps there's methods that I could do this better? Okay, and the CRA seems really willing to help people in this pre-claim process review stage. I think that maybe when it first came out, it was used more to dissuade people, or claimants, but lately it's having more of a positive impact. Okay. So as we said, what we want to do is review the contracts, make sure that the contracts are structured properly. If they're not, perhaps see if we can redo the contract. Make sure that we deduct any grants or contract payments or government assistance. And one of our other practitioners recommend maybe even looking at the personal tax return. It's a good idea to understand for a claimant in a medical professional corporation, again, where they have income. Do they have the dual income? So if I'm engaged just by the medical professional corporation, but they are doing other work and someone else is doing their T1, it's still good to know what the overall setup is and that we explain that in the allocation of the costs. Okay. One of the points here is the CRA has something called a First-Time Claimant Advisory Service, or FTCAS. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the statistics a little later on, but this was being introduced to most medical professional corporations when they did their first claim. And what we found several years ago, both myself and several other practitioners that I've talked to, is that the meetings were used to perhaps approve 1 year of a client's claim, but then to dissuade them from claiming for various reasons that we talked about, whether they're directly engaged or other types of issues. And clients in this case, as medical practitioners, tend to really want to follow the tax laws. They don't want any problems with the Canada Revenue Agency. And if the Canada Revenue Agency, tells them clearly and unequivocally that they shouldn't do it, they'll probably not do it. So what we found as practitioners is, and I've asked around, is that this problem is not as problematic in the last year or two. However, there may be issues on it in that practitioners, I know many practitioners in the past have been dissuaded from claiming, and maybe wrongly so. So they should think about perhaps coming back and revisiting whether they are eligible and ask for a process review or talk to a consultant on that. Okay. All right. Now I'll basically turn that back to Earl if there's any questions on that. Field it before we move on to the section on statistics and new programs. And in the new section here, actually, let me just double check something. The first speaker in the new section will actually be Susan Grant. We had to do a little shuffle in our presentation order here, so we moved that one up, just that she had another conflicting presentation today. So she'll be the next speaker, and I'll pass it back to you, Earl, then, if you want to field any questions before we move on to the next section.
Yeah, thank you. There is one person's raised their hand. For question purposes, it's probably best to type in the chat, but we'll make a quick exception here. Go ahead, your question. G. Shaw, no. Out there. Julie, did you want to make a comment?
I can't find the chat section, so I wasn't able to put my questions in. Could you help me direct to where I enter a chat or a comment?
Just go ahead. We can hear you, Julie. We can hear you.
I know you can hear me now, but
We're seeing also, just to add to the the discouragement from CRA when they visit you on the first time claimant advisory, even after a form, a rejection of the claim, they're sort of giving appendixes or writing in the appendix that you don't have a loss, or you've incurred. And so they discourage you from even going down the notice, filing a notice of objection, because you'd have to write a letter asking the agency to issue a form T67AM for a loss determination.
Oh, okay.
I was wondering if, have you seen that as a practice? Yeah, go ahead.
That's actually an interest. That's specific to each company. So you're right. So you ask, basically you need to have a notice of objection, or sorry, a notice of assessment to file a claim. If it's a loss situation, it may be argued that that's not assessment, so you ask for something called a notice of determination. Ultimately, that's really just a formality. You request that, and it's going to add a little time, so it could affect your deadlines and things like that. But it shouldn't be something that prevents the objection. To make a long story short.
Thank you.
Okay. So do you want me to make some comments there, Dave? Since
Please, Julie,
I think
go
you guys
ahead.
can hear me, right? Okay.
Yes.
So going back to the beginning of your presentation with regards to the contract payments. The way it was explained to me is that ITC, because this came up in one of my cases many years ago, ITC apparently is not transferable. So it's not like two Canadian companies can decide which one of them is going to get it, right? It's an entitlement based on the facts. And that's why if you have a foreign entity, that's the contract, there is no entitlement on the other side, and it can revert to the Canadian. But where you made a comment about, which one of the Canadian companies is going to take it, and if one doesn't take it, then the other can. My understanding from an audit years ago is that that's not the case, and that even if one company that's a Canadian company that's entitled to it chooses not to claim it, they cannot transfer it, right? So that's maybe something you might want to look into at the legal level of the transferability of ITC and the entitlement between two Canadian taxpayers. I also wanted to mention with regards to the contracts with the MPC, and it's something I was chatting with you about last night. So a lot of times the contract with the HCE is they put the name of the doctor. And then CRA's position is, well, you've contracted with the doctor. But what's fascinating about it is they don't actually contract with the doctor. They pay all the funds to the MPC. But, technically, it looks like they've contracted with the doctor because the doctor's name is on there. And I think it's more of a technicality or an inconsistency at the HCE level because they don't realize the significance of it. But the question of law I have is, well, did they really contract with the person if they make all the payments to the MPC, right? So then I would revert to a matter of logic is that, well, they probably did contract with the MPC since they, in fact, just pay the MPC on a regular basis, and they don't actually pay the person either as a subcontractor, privately, or through a T4. So that's something I think that should be clarified and raised with CRA, is that contract payment is perhaps a little bit more relevant than the administrative issue of a hospital who doesn't recognize the difference on the contract. And with regards to the directly undertaken, I have some concerns with directly undertaken where, CRA takes a position that the work was not undertaken on behalf of the MPC, but was undertaken on behalf of another party. And at that point, I also go back to the payments. So I find this peculiar, or maybe a little bit intriguing, where we have the doctor who does not actually work for any other entity, or receive a T4 from any other entity and only works for his or her MPC. And therefore, the logic would be, well, they must have undertaken their work on behalf of the MPC because it is their only source of income. And as you mentioned, and I've also put it out there before, look at the personal tax return. So if there is no personal income from any other source, is there any merit to the argument that the work was done on behalf of another party? Well, in that case, we have to ask whether they volunteered, right? So this comes into other legal questions, and I think the personal tax return has been very helpful. And for us, it's been helpful in arguments when we've been in the rebuttal stage. So those are some of the things I wanted to comment. And with regards to protocol development, I've been in a situation before where I've asked a high-ranking CRA auditor whether the candidate client needs to have proved that they developed the protocol themselves. And the answer was no, that the uncertainty is the uncertainty whether they developed the protocol themselves or not, whether it was handed to them, which is often the case in a clinical trial. That reviewer did not believe that it was relevant. But the problem is that it's not really particularly written down anywhere in policy about all these documents the CRA is asking for, and whether protocol development is in fact a criteria or not. So I personally would like to see more discussions with CRA about the clinical trials, in international clinical trials, and whether the protocol development itself is actually a criteria or not. Those are some of the comments that I had based upon your very worthwhile introduction to the discussion, and we of course do a lot of cases like you do in this sector. So I think I just wanted to add a little bit of feedback there, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank
Okay,
you.
great.